Welcome to the Soul to Rise channel. This is a space where we talk about personal growth, inner awakening, and consciously manifesting a life that is aligned with who we truly are. Here, we're not looking for quick fixes, but for deeper understanding of ourselves, our patterns, and the moments that change the direction of our lives. Today, we're talking about one of those moments. The moment when you realize that for years you believed you were the problem, and then it becomes clear that you never were. There is a moment you don't remember by the date, but by the feeling. A moment when you sit down, pause, and for the first time stop trying to fix yourself. You don't look for mistakes. You don't analyze. You don't replay everything in your head. You just sit there and realize how tired you are. Tired of constantly thinking that you are the one doing something wrong. Tired of questioning yourself after every situation, every sentence, every relationship. And in that exhaustion, one thought appears, quiet but clear. What if I was never the problem? For years, you believed you were. You believed it because people showed you that, maybe not directly, but clearly enough. When you said how you felt, they told you that you were overreacting. When you pulled back, they said you were cold. When you asked for an explanation, they said you were difficult. There was always something about you that needed to be fixed. And you tried. You tried to be calmer, quieter, simpler. You tried not to react right away, not to ask questions, not to show how much you cared. You remember how many times you told yourself that next time you wouldn't react, that you would stay silent, that you would let it go. And you did. Many times. You stayed quiet when something didn't make sense to you. You laughed when it wasn't funny. You stayed when your body was telling you to leave. And every time, you told yourself that this was maturity, that this was strength, that the problem was in you, and that you had to learn how to be different. But the truth was much simpler than you could see back then. You weren't too emotional. You were emotional in an environment that didn't know what to do with emotions. You weren't complicated. You were someone looking for clarity in relationships full of mixed signals. You weren't difficult. You were honest among people who avoided the truth. There was one situation that kept repeating itself. Always the same story, just a different day. Something would hurt you, maybe not intentionally, but enough to make you feel unsettled. And you would try to talk about it. Calmly. Without blaming. Just to understand. And the response would always be the same. You're too sensitive. You're making a problem again. You always have to dig into things. And every time, you would pull back with the same feeling. Guilt. And that question in your mind of why you couldn't just be like everyone else. Over time, you learned to see your reactions as mistakes. When you felt upset, you told yourself there was no reason. When you felt sadness, you minimized it. When you felt discomfort, you pushed it aside. You became very good at convincing yourself that your emotions didn't matter. And the more you did that, the further away you moved from yourself. But the truth was that you didn't react because you wanted attention. You reacted because you wanted safety. You wanted to know where you stood. You wanted consistency. You wanted words and actions to make sense together. And when you didn't get that, your inner world became unsettled. Not because you were dramatic, but because you were confused. You remember how often you chose to pull away instead of explaining yourself. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew you would end up being the problem again. And so you learned that peace meant silence. That stability meant endurance. That love meant adapting. And then that moment happened. Maybe you looked back at your relationships. Maybe you heard someone else's story that sounded too familiar. Maybe you simply realized that with some people you felt calm, and with others you were constantly tense. And for the first time, You didn't blame yourself. For the first time, you asked yourself whether it was possible that the problem was never you, but the dynamic you were in. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. You understood why you were so tired. Because you were constantly trying to fit into relationships that required you to give up yourself. Because you were gentle where gentleness was seen as weakness. Because you were honest where silence was rewarded. You realized that you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for the basics. To be heard. To be taken seriously. To have your emotions respected, not mocked or minimized. And you realized that people who couldn't offer that often labeled you as the problem, because it was easier than facing their own limitations. In that moment, something inside you loosens. Not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of relief. You stop fighting yourself. You stop looking for what needs to be fixed. You start seeing yourself as you always were, as someone who feels deeply, as someone who notices nuances, as someone who cares. And that's when your energy begins to change. You don't become a different person. You simply stop shrinking yourself. You start setting boundaries quietly, but clearly. You don't explain yourself. You don't convince anyone. If you constantly feel wrong somewhere, you leave. If someone doesn't listen to you, you stop speaking. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Your confidence doesn't appear overnight. It returns slowly, through small moments where you choose yourself. Through decisions not to stay where you have to justify who you are. Through the sense of peace that comes when you stop seeking validation from people who were never willing to give it. And in the end, you realize something that changes how you see your entire past. All those situations where you thought you were the problem now look different. You see a person trying to survive in an environment that wasn't safe. You see yourself doing the best you could with what you knew at the time. And there is no more guilt. Only understanding. You were never the problem. You were just in the wrong place, with the wrong people, for too long, trying to explain your depth to those who didn't know how to swim. And when you realize that, you know this is the end of the old story. The story where you believed you had to change in order to be accepted. And the beginning of a new one. The one where you know that your worth was never in question. You simply learned where it no longer needs to be proven.